Okay, I'm gonna try and make a really quick video since the last time I did this sort of video with the armors for the Exile, it kind of went a little long, so I'm gonna try and shorten it a bit. So the idea here is I'm gonna go over the base stats, obviously from armor choice to weapons, and then obviously the combination of the two. You will notice like Scythe and Spear and Shield both have, high health, but they lose energy. Um, the Scythe is faster than the Spear and Shield, but then Spear and Shield obviously has one of the highest resistance spreads, so that's pretty nice. But all in all, we're just going to go over the basic understanding of each one. Health, pretty obvious. If you run out of health, you die. The more health you have, generally the longer you'll survive, but that is not a guaranteed thing. Then we go to energy. Obviously that's your mana, stamina, energy, whatever you want to call it. Whenever you use abilities, you spend that, and when you run out, you're unable to use any of your abilities. Determination, this one's a little weird, and I know this question gets asked a lot in help chat. So what determination does is when you actually get hit by crowd control abilities, it will fill up, and then once that bar is full, it will give you crowd control immunity for a set duration. So when you look at the base armor stats, for example, where it says, 1,100, 800, 1,200 just in the base stats, and then when you look at the other weapons and armor combinations, what this means is you divide the value by 10. Well, not 10, by 100, sorry. You divide the value by 100 to determine how many seconds of crowd control immunity you have after, which to me seems a little silly because if we look at the combinations, we see 13, 10, 14, 12, 9, 13, 10, 7, 11, 13, 10, 14, 12, 9, 13. So there's not really much variation there in terms of actual crowd control immunity duration. Like we're talking a few seconds at best, which yes, there's a little bit of benefits there, but it's not enough to where it's crazy, and even then, determination is one of those stats where it rounds up to the nearest hundredth. So say you have 1,250. It's going to round up to 13 seconds, not down to 12 seconds. So that seems a little strange in and of itself. Then we go to run speed. This one's really not that tricky. You pretty much divide the value again by 100, and what this will determine is your meters per second. So obviously most of the speeds are around, 4.5 to 5.45 seems to be the highest. And that's before considering, any modifiers for your weapon, your armor, etc. when you're crafting them, which will obviously increase these stats. But for the most part, you're looking at around 4.5 to 5.45 meters a second before outside modifiers. Ability speed, pretty much the same thing as determination. You divide that by 100 to determine what your actual value is. So, for example, when we're looking at Scythe and Robe, it says 1,050. What that means is that you have a 5% increase to your ability cast time. So obviously, if, say, it has a 100-second cast time, just as an example, 5 seconds are taken off of that. Obviously, since most abilities in the Exiled do not actually have very long cast times, this isn't a very important stat. Like, yeah, it can be useful, but it's very minimal where it is useful for. I can only think of maybe 2 abilities that this would be a major factor in, which would probably be Incinerate and Gravity Well. Everything else, well, Healing Totem as well, but that's pretty much going to be it in terms of very long cast time abilities. So for the most part, it's not going to be crazy on casting time. But obviously you see certain instances where Totem or Bow or Staff, where their ability speed is actually considerably lower than the rest. So it'll be very obvious when, you're trying to cast a very long ability versus your normal abilities, which generally only have a 0.1 second cast time, or maybe a 1 second cast time. But again, you can modify your equipment to actually increase this, so it's not as big of a deal. And then we go over cooldown speed. This is actually the most important DPS stat in the game, because this means you will be able to reuse your abilities faster, which includes basic attacks, which, yes, they only have, like, you know, generally a 1 second, if not 0.9 second delay in terms of cooldown, but the higher your cooldown, the faster you can apply that damage, the faster you can reuse that damage, so it's actually the biggest form of DPS increase in the game. Now, if you mix the two with ability speed and cooldown, obviously that's going to be your best bet, but cooldown speed has more emphasis on DPS than ability speed. And then, of course, we have normal resistance spreads, which obviously the base stats, you start at 0, armor is going to play a huge role, and then obviously your weapon choice is going to play a decent role there. War Scythe, because of its extreme offensive capabilities, and it actually has a very good tool set. I can understand why it has a negative 15% resistance to both mental and physical. While, you know, Staff and Totem, they have, you know, solid physical defense while having more mental defense than anything else. Staff is tied with Spear and Shield, which seems to be equal with the negative effects of Scythe. So Spear and Shield is very tanky, and next being Totem, after that Staff, and then Bow, and then Scythe. But for the most part, that pretty much plays out to their offensive capabilities, except for Staff, which actually has very high offensive capability, but its defense is surprisingly high. I don't feel it should gain any physical resist. It would make more sense if that all went into mental, rather than it having any physical defense at all. Simply because the fact Staff is one of those heavy burst, heavy DPS, very strong utility set. And even then, if I had to consider Spear and Shield versus Scythe, there is some benefits because of the speed, the ability speed and the cooldown not being hit, so I guess it's really just a matter of opinion. For the most part, the stats aren't going to really be a huge issue, other than, say, armor type, which is where most of the issue comes into, which is what we're going to go over here in a second. Okay, we're going to do a quick run through of each armor. So, Robe, we're pretty much going to go over, like, you know, generalized complaints, like what might be overpowered, what might not be. Aura of Healing, a lot of people are using it to, you know, heal themselves, but really it's more of an out-of-combat heal or a heal over time stripper, because of the fact that its hot is very strong. You can activate it for just a second, turn it back off, and you'll take off any heal over times in the area, so that's pretty useful. Just don't, you know, accidentally hit it twice, because, you know, you're giving them more health from that than they would have received from another heal over time at that point. At least on average. But I would not recommend trying to use Aura of Healing while you're fighting, simply because, you know, the heal that it's going to give you versus the energy it's going to take is probably not going to be that beneficial. You probably could pair it with Draining Burst and sort of make it worthwhile, but I would still say Aura of Healing, out of combat healing, and more so of a heal over time stripper rather than actually using it for proper healing. Other than that, Robe, for some reason, has a plethora of escapes. You know, you have Blink, you have Decoy, you have Swap, and you have Delayed Teleport. So for the most part, you will most likely never be catched on this armor type if you even take 2, maybe even 3 of these abilities on your bar, which I would probably say, you know, Blink is a must-have, Delayed Teleport I would probably say is a must-have, and then you could decide between Decoy and Swap, but that's personal preference. Another ability I would say you'd probably want on your bar is Aether Form, which this is a very controversial ability for me, because I don't understand why a Robe, you know, you'd think caster, you think damage dealer, has the ability to give themselves crowd control immunity, and this can be up pretty much indefinitely, as long as you have your cooldown high enough, especially when you level it, and the fact that Robe already passively gets an extremely crowd control reduction, not crowd control reduction, cooldown reduction. But obviously they have a crowd control reduction too because, you know, Aether Form. But all in all, like, this type of setup, if anything, it doesn't make sense that Robe has so many escapes and so much solid utility. You know, you have Draining Burst, which won't remove any Mesmerize from the delayed teleport, so that's very viable. Earthquake can be set up afterwards for a burst, and then you have, you know, the option of 2 or 3 escapes, and you have crowd control immunity. It just doesn't make sense. But that being said, you know, Ghost Form is pretty much not worth the time. There's not enough information in the tooltip to tell you whether or not the effect of physical damage increase on yourself is the same as the mental, and even then there's usually a lot of physical damage dealers, so Ghost Form probably wouldn't be recommended in any situation unless you're fighting mostly mental damage. Energize is sort of like Juggernaut but for energy without a debuff, which again doesn't really make sense, but I can see where they're going with it. It feels like a wasted skill slot. Chaos Bolts, if it didn't have a cast time, you could actually make use of that ability. But, you know, it's easy to dodge the projectiles, and it's not that impressive. Deflective Shield, I don't understand why it goes down to a 0 cooldown and 0 cost. I haven't seen someone abuse it yet, but I know for a fact if you were using that ability effectively, you're going to screw over any, pretty much just bow users. Everyone else will be relatively safe, other than Totem probably for poison. Just poison specifically, but it just doesn't make any sense. Like, you can activate it while a projectile's coming at you, it's going to reflect it back, and then it had no cost, it had no cooldown. When you get to level 20, it just seems like a very strong defensive ability. Granted, that being said, it doesn't work on melee effects, so that's kind of strange. And I do kind of want to see, it would be funny if, you know, somebody hit Deflective Shield before like a pull from the War Scythe, and if it would actually pull the War Scythe to the delayed not the Deflective Shield user, or if it simply would just somehow hold it in place. I haven't seen it done yet, but I want to actually see that being used. If I can, I'll try and record a video of that. But all in all, Robe, extremely powerful armor set, definitely recommended for new players, and is probably the general consensus of the community that Robe is just extremely powerful in all forms of play. Like, be it, you know, you want to try and tank, you know, Aether Form, you have a good crowd control ability, delay teleport, and you have a drain to be able to keep your energy and your health up, and then you have a solid burst ability, Earthquake. It just kind of all plays in, but I would probably say I would maybe ignore Earthquake in that regard, because depending on the weapon I'm using, I might want at least 4 or 5 weapon abilities, so I'd have to limit my choices there. But for the most part, Aether Form, pretty much required. Delay teleport, I would probably say again, is required. You'd pick between Draining Burst and Earthquake, and then blink every single time. Leather, for some ungodly reason, this armor type, the only thing that doesn't make sense to me is its stealth abilities. Hide, very good for setting up an ambush for your team, because you know you can put Hide on 1 to 5 people, so that's pretty nice. You know, you can set up a gank. As long as they don't step out of the circle, they will not lose stealth. That's fantastic. Lonely Prowl makes sense for what it does, but the one I'm going to complain about actually is going to be Smokescreen and Sneak Attack. Obviously, if you know how stealth works, when you take damage, you get revealed. And with Sneak Attack, you know, you just go into stealth right then and there. If someone hits you, you're going to be out of stealth. If you didn't stay in stealth long enough, you're not going to get the damage buff. So you have to be very careful when you use Sneak Attack. Otherwise, you will lose its effect, and then you pretty much got nothing for that, other than spending your energy to go into stealth for a second for someone to break it. Smokescreen is actually the one I'll complain about more, because at least Sneak Attack gets a damage buff. Smokescreen, yeah, it's instant. Yeah, it gives a snare, but if someone hits you, you're going to come out of that stealth. If you attack, you're going to come out of that stealth, and you can't step out of the smoke screen while it's active. Otherwise, you simply, again, come out of stealth. Which, you know, I would think Smokescreen would be like, you know, it would be like Sneak Attack, but with no buff, simply a snare, so you could use it, and someone would try and, attack you, whatever, and you could just run out of it, because obviously the idea is to have it as an option for escape. But it actually just, puts an area for you to get hit, because the smoke screen is not that big. So for the most part, almost every attack, if it hits the center of that ability, it's going to bring you out of stealth, and it's going to be wasted, so that feels very weak. Obviously, it has a crowd control clear for roots and snares, and builds 250 determination for each, so half of your determination bar. Fantastic. Obviously has a very good reactive ability tumble. They try and hit you regardless of the distance they are from you. You stun them, you do damage. Fantastic. It has Zephyr for energy regen. Movement speed penalty is not applied while it's active for moving backwards and side to side. Great. Drain life when you do direct damage. You leech it back. So, I mean, for the most part, this armor, it has some mobility with sprint, freedom when you get crowd controlled. It has good sustain between life, leech, and Zephyr, but other than that, you're pretty much looking at their attack steroids, preparation, and sneak attack. Preparation is kind of niche because you probably won't use it when you're trying to engage. You want it in the aftermath of it, which once the debuff runs off, you get that cooldown reduction thereafter. So that's really nice. But all in all, I'd probably say most people will probably be using Drain Life, Zephyr, Freedom, Tumble, and maybe Sneak Attack. But of course, there are a few people using Captivating Sprint because of that movement speed increase. But all in all, this armor actually feels relatively balanced. The only things, like I said, I complain about is smoke screen. It doesn't feel like it's a good ability whatsoever. And then of course, your traps have cast times, which is probably the only reason I personally wouldn't use traps other than in PvE or hope someone runs on it. It's very situational. So you fix the armor by removing the cast times on the traps. Fantastic. They would be actually very good abilities, or at least trap, because it's a single target route. But only if they run on it, and if you have a cast time, it's not going to happen. And then, well, preparation, it's really just that debuff at the beginning. It's a situational buff. Like it'll work, but you need to be careful when you use it and what you use while you're waiting for that in case you are already engaging. But other than that, I would probably say Smokescreen and Sneak Attack. I don't feel they should break on damage, only because of the fact of how they work. If you attack, that's something different. But if you get attacked, I feel like these two should be a little more forgiving in that aspect. You can actually use them for escape rather than simply, oh, well, guess what? Get fucked because I'm just going to hit you. You don't get the damage buff from Sneak Attack. And the smoke screen, well, I've never seen someone effectively use smoke screen. Hell, I've tried to make it work, and it's just bad. It's a bad ability. So we're already looking at 10 minutes there, so we're going to try and wrap this up really quick. Splint Mail, slowest armor in the game. Its only gap closer is aggressive leap, but it silences you when you use it, and half the time it doesn't even go to the destination that you want it to. And if you have no target, you can't use it for that either. It's basically a poor man's lunge from Spear and Shield, but, yeah, you can do damage to the targets unlike lunge, and yes, you can stun the targets unlike lunge, but you're not doing damage at that time. And then for the rest of it, you can pretty much go over the Splint Mail skills, but it's weird that a tanking line, the only good abilities under it, Ignore Pain, Barge, Meat Shield, Juggernaut, and Self-Sacrifice, everything else is questionable at best. For example, Meditation is a troll skill, Silencing Field, you can't attack during it, it gives way too much determination. It really should have just been like, hey, it's an active ability, you hit it, it silences, and that's it. Not constantly building determination, not constantly refreshing, just boom, there's the silence, here we go. Dampening Field, it costs energy, way too much energy for an ability that can debuff your team, simply because of the fact that it's an area effect. So it already actually has a punishment system, but then it costs energy. So all in all, seeing as Splint Mail has no way to manage its energy, it's the only armor actually that can't manage its energy, at least in that regard. It has no way to buff it, it has no way to recover it, it simply is there. So dampening field could be useful, but it eats energy and it can hurt your team. Doesn't make sense, seeing as Splint Mail seems to be that group supportive role more than anything else, so that's kind of sad. Sponge form, it's poor man's revitalize, very, very crappy. It needs more information on the tooltip to actually be considered whether or not it's actually useful. But so far, my revitalize on totem is superior to sponge form in cooldown, in duration, and in obviously healing effectiveness. So that's kind of sad. Juggernaut definitely needs to be able to have its movement speed reduction go down as it levels, because 1 through 10 it still stays at -8 meters a second rather than going to 0.4 meters a second. Self-sacrifice, kind of sad on the radius, but it's still a good heal because it's a 30% to a 50% heal. So that's really nice. It hits all people in that area. You can move around before you finish casting it, so that's very handy. But I feel the radius should scale up with level or be a little bit bigger regardless. Meat Shield definitely needs to have its tooltip specify that it goes up in duration every 3 levels. So at 3 it has an increased duration of 1 second, and it also should probably specify its actual base duration of 3 seconds. So that's kind of sad as well. Meditation, again, troll ability, it doesn't really have a use other than trolling. That's really sad. If you dispel the debuff from like a teammate does it for you and then they buff your resistance, yeah, you're healing a bunch of health, but you're not getting any energy, and they're probably not going to focus you, or they'll just back up and regroup if it seems like it's going to punish them for trying to attack you instead. But anyone watching this, you cannot stop meditation. The only thing you can do is try and outdamage it. And my recommendation to you, if you cannot outdamage it, switch targets or regroup. Do not sit there and try and beat on a meditation user and use all your energy on something stupid. Or try and do a lot of burst to him at once, because healing per second is just healing per second. It's very possible to do enough damage to a target that is completely immobile just to burst them. Transform Pain, it heals you based on the damage that is dealt to you. It's not a flat heal or anything like that, so it's actually the worst reactive ability in the game, in my opinion. Simply because of the fact you can't attack during it, and you're pretty much just sitting there hoping, they don't use a weak ability to heal you. Because, if I hit you with an auto attack, it says 30, it's only going to heal you for 30. So, all in all, that trade probably wasn't worth it. And the fact that you weren't doing damage to me at that time probably wasn't worth it. Barge, fantastic ability. Probably should have more movement speed as a buffer to it, but it's still a fantastic ability. Ignore Pain. If it didn't have an energy cost, I could see it being more useful, but because it hits your health and your energy, that's kind of annoying. But, being able to be immune to direct damage for the duration, still extremely viable. But all in all, Splint Mail is the worst overall armor for open field PvP and chasing or escaping. So for the most part, Splint Mail is at the bottom of the barrel. Leather would be obviously the second best, and then Robe, for some reason, just has everything going for it. Literally everything going for it. But that pretty much covers it, and that should make this whole video not too much longer than about 23, 24 minutes. So hopefully this is actually helpful for someone, not to mention the fact if the development team possibly watches YouTube videos, maybe you should consider these things. Just saying.